Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Well, let's test that theory, shall we?
Carl Gustav Jung was born on July 26, 1875, in the small Swiss village of Keswil by the shore of Lake Constance. The world he entered was torn between tradition and uncertainty. His father, Paul Jung, was a Protestant pastor who struggled with doubt and a declining faith. His mother, Emily, lived in cycles of depression, spending long nights in another room, claiming that spirits visited her, whispering secrets from the unseen world. From the beginning, Carl was caught between two realities, the rigid dogmas of religion and the mysterious realm of visions, shadows, and voices. He would later say that his childhood home contained two spiritual atmospheres, one belonging to his father, sterile, theological, suffocating, and one belonging to his mother, dark, numinous, filled with ghostly presences. Both would shape him forever. As a child, Jung rarely played with other children. He preferred solitude, immersing himself in imagination. He felt divided, as if he was not just one boy, but two. There was number one, the child of the present moment, attending school, walking the village streets. And there was number two, an ancient personality, timeless, living in centuries long past, watching the world with solemn wisdom. This strange duality haunted him. He sensed that his destiny would not be to live like others, but to descend into depths most people avoided. Jung's childhood was filled with dreams that he could not explain. He dreamt of vast cathedrals, of radiant figures and terrifying beings. In one of his earliest memories, he saw a glowing underground chamber with a strange throne and a golden phallus, a vision that disturbed and fascinated him. For most people, such dreams would fade. For Jung, they became the very foundation of his psychology. He came to believe that the human soul speaks in symbols, and that dreams are not illusions, but messages from a deeper order of reality. When Jung was 12, he fainted at school one day. Doctors found nothing physically wrong. He later admitted he had discovered the power of psychosomatic illness, that his psyche could shield him from the unbearable. He deliberately nurtured his fainting spells as a way to avoid the demands of education, until one day he realized with horror that he might cripple his own life if he continued. From that point, he decided to confront life directly, to take responsibility, even if it meant struggle. This experience was a first glimpse of what he would later call the shadow, the dangerous, sabotaging parts of oneself that must be confronted, or they will consume you. By the time he entered the University of Basel in 1895, Jung was already obsessed with questions most of his peers dismissed. He studied medicine, but his real passion was the mystery of the human soul. He devoured philosophy, mythology, and theology alongside anatomy and neurology. At first, he considered becoming a surgeon or a natural scientist. But one day, while reading a psychiatric textbook, he felt struck by lightning. "I felt the most intense excitement," he recalled later, "as though this field was calling me. From that moment I knew psychiatry was my destiny." In 1900, Jung began work at the famous Burghalsli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich under Eugen Bleuler, a pioneer who coined the term schizophrenia. The hospital was not a place of gentle care, but of locked wards, disturbed patients, and the stigma of madness. Yet Jung approached the patients differently. He listened. He believed their delusions and hallucinations were not just meaningless noise, but symbolic language, distorted, yes, but carrying truth. At Burghalsli, Jung developed his word association experiments. He would present a patient with a list of words, mother, death, fear, love, and measure their reaction time, their slips, their nervous laughter. He discovered that certain words triggered emotional disturbances, revealing hidden wounds in the psyche. He called these constellations complexes. The mother complex, the power complex, the inferiority complex, terms we still use today, were born in those wards in Zurich. This work earned Jung recognition across Europe. It showed that the unconscious could be studied empirically, not just speculated about. But for Jung, these experiments were more than science. They were proof that the unconscious had autonomy, that there were forces inside us that could betray us, control us, and speak against our will. He later wrote, "In each of us there is another whom we do not know." During these years, Jung also sought stability in his personal life. In 1903, he married Emma Rauschenbach, a woman of intelligence and independent means. Their marriage was complex, at times strained, but enduring. Emma became not just his wife, but eventually a Jungian analyst in her own right, an anchor in his turbulent life, and the mother of his 5 children. By his late 20s, Jung had already built the foundations of what would become one of the most influential psychologies of the 20th century. He was a man torn between science and mysticism, between family life and the abyss of the unconscious. A physician who could measure a pulse with clinical precision, but who also listened to dreams as though they were divine revelations. But Jung's childhood visions went deeper still. He once described a game he played alone. In the garden near his home lay a large stone. As a boy, Jung would sit upon it for hours, speaking to it silently. Sometimes he imagined he was the stone, ancient and immovable. Other times, he felt it was listening to him. In these moments, he touched a secret sense of eternity. Later he admitted that this simple childhood game revealed to him that the soul is not confined to the body. It stretches into the timeless. He also carved small wooden figures and hid them in a pencil case, drawing tiny scrolls of messages for them. He treated them like sacred idols. Years later, Jung saw in this child's ritual a foreshadowing of his lifelong fascination with myth, symbol, and religion. What to adults might look like mere play was, for him, the unconscious acting itself out through sacred drama. The tension between his parents only deepened this inner world. His father, worn down by doubt, could not give Jung living faith. "My father lost his God," Jung later reflected, "and I had to find mine." His mother, on the other hand, terrified him with her sudden mood shifts and her insistence on the presence of spirits. Jung lived between a father who seemed spiritually dead and a mother possessed by invisible forces. The boy who felt himself divided into 2 personalities was simply reflecting the fracture of his household. This duality, reason and mysticism, science and soul, would follow him forever. It is why, even as he studied medicine and neurology, he was drawn irresistibly to philosophy, to the mysteries of ancient texts, to stories of gods and demons. Jung felt that truth could never be reduced to chemistry alone. As a student, Jung was already collecting strange fragments of wisdom that most of his peers ignored. He filled notebooks with sketches of temples and mandalas, symbols that seemed to rise from some unknown part of himself. He read Goethe and Kant, studied the Church Fathers, devoured myths of the Greeks and the Gnostics. To Jung, philosophy and mythology were not idle curiosities. They were living keys to the hidden structure of the psyche. The sense of being divided between number 1 and number 2 only intensified. Sometimes he felt that his everyday self, the boy attending lectures, dissecting cadavers, taking exams, was the illusion, while the ancient, timeless self was the reality. Number 2, he wrote, was more real than the schoolboy Carl. This gave him both a strange confidence and a deep loneliness. He belonged partly to the 19th century and partly to something far older. Even his classmates noticed. Jung was brilliant, but eccentric. He spoke of dreams as though they were revelations. He treated symbols with the seriousness of facts. To many, he seemed unusual, perhaps even unsettling. But this isolation only pushed him further inward, convinced that the real secrets of existence would never be found in the laboratory alone, but in the hidden architecture of the soul. But Jung was not content to leave these intuitions untested. He began to see his own life as a laboratory of the psyche. Every dream, every stray image, every feeling of déjà vu, he treated as data. While his peers laughed at superstitions, Jung copied passages from alchemical texts and medieval mystics into his notebooks, convinced that the symbols of the past were alive in the present. He once remarked that what modern man dismissed as myth was often the most precise language of the soul. For him, the gods of antiquity had not vanished. They had simply taken new forms, living on in human imagination. To study psychology was therefore not only to heal the mind, but to recover the forgotten heritage of humanity itself. At Bergallslee, where he began his psychiatric career, this conviction only grew stronger. While others dismissed psychotic ravings as meaningless, Jung listened closely. One schizophrenic patient described a vision of the sun with a tube attached to it, through which the wind of the spirit blew. Jung recognized the image. It matched an ancient Mithraic text unknown to the patient. Such moments convinced him that madness was not simply chaos, it was myth breaking through the fragile walls of the conscious mind. His word association experiments also revealed hidden depths. A young woman might hesitate at the word father, or laugh nervously at the word death, betraying the unseen wound beneath. By measuring tiny delays, Jung showed that the unconscious speaks in slips and silences, and the heat rising to the cheeks. These discoveries made him believe the unconscious was not a mere dump of repressed material, but a living system with its own voice. And then came Emma. Their marriage in 1903 was not a simple domestic bond, but a meeting of minds. Emma Jung was intelligent, fiercely independent, and later trained as an analyst herself. She challenged him, grounded him, and endured the storms of his obsession with the unconscious. To the outside world, she was his wife. To Jung, she became a partner in the alchemical laboratory of life, standing beside him as he ventured into territories that blurred the line between genius and madness. By the end of his first decade as a physician, Carl Jung was no ordinary doctor. He was already something stranger. A scientist with instruments in his hands and myths in his blood. He believed that every delusion concealed a story, every dream concealed a truth, and every human being carried a hidden double inside. He had glimpsed the abyss. And it was only the beginning. Soon, Jung would meet the man who would define the next chapter of his journey, Sigmund Freud. In 1906, a letter traveled from Zurich to Vienna. Inside it was a copy of Jung's research on word associations, sent to a man whose name was already whispered across Europe with both awe and suspicion, Sigmund Freud. Freud read it carefully. He was impressed. Here was a young Swiss psychiatrist with rigorous experiments proving the existence of unconscious complexes, a scientist, not just a theorist. Freud wrote back immediately, beginning a correspondence that would soon swell into hundreds of pages. When they met in Vienna in 1907, the two men spoke for 13 hours straight. 13 hours, as if they had both been starving for a conversation that finally had no limits. Freud, 20 years older, saw in Jung a brilliant successor. My crown prince, he called him. Jung, in turn, felt he had found a spiritual father, a man who dared to enter the forbidden world of dreams, sexuality, and the unconscious. For a time, their relationship was filled with enthusiasm. They exchanged theories, case histories, and confessions of their own dreams. Freud even shared a dream of his about Jung, interpreting it as proof that Jung would one day carry on his legacy. To the psychoanalytic movement, still ridiculed by the medical establishment, Jung was the perfect ally, a respected hospital doctor, a Protestant from neutral Switzerland, untarnished by the anti-Semitic hostility Freud endured in Vienna. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Freud saw the unconscious primarily as a vault of repressed desires, above all, sexual desires. He believed neurotic symptoms arose from hidden sexual conflicts, and he demanded loyalty to this doctrine. Jung respected Freud's genius, but he felt the theory was too narrow. To Jung, the unconscious was not just a trash heap of forbidden wishes. It was also a creative force, filled with mythic images, a reservoir of human potential. The more Jung listened to patients, the more he encountered material Freud's framework could not explain. People dreamt of gods, monsters, symbols that reached far beyond their personal history. A psychotic patient described visions strikingly similar to ancient religious texts, texts the patient could never have read. Such experiences convinced Jung that the unconscious had a universal, collective layer. Freud was alarmed. He warned Jung against dangerous mysticism. Jung, in turn, was unsettled by Freud's insistence on dogma. At one meeting in 1910, Freud pressed him, "Promise me you will never abandon the sexual theory." Jung hesitated. He later recalled feeling a shiver, as though science had been replaced by a creed. "This was my first inkling of Freud's limitations," Jung wrote. "I could not accept the theory as a dogma." Still, they worked together. In 1910, Jung was elected the first president of the International Psychoanalytical Association, largely because Freud believed his young disciple could secure respectability for the movement. Publicly, Jung defended Freud. Privately, his doubts grew. By 1912, the tension erupted. Jung published Symbols of Transformation, a book that reinterpreted libido not as sexual energy alone, but as a general life force. He filled its pages with myth, religion, and symbolism, showing how human drives express themselves in images of gods and heroes. To Freud, this was betrayal. He saw Jung drifting into metaphysics, abandoning the scientific purity of psychoanalysis. Their letters became cold, sharp. Misunderstandings multiplied. What had once been a dialogue turned into a duel. Freud, who had once confessed dreams to Jung, now accused him of disloyalty. Jung, who had once seen Freud as a father, now felt suffocated by his demand for obedience. The final break came in 1913. In Munich, at a tense conference, the two men faced each other across the room. Freud collapsed briefly from what seemed like fainting. Jung interpreted it as a psychosomatic symbol, the body speaking what words could not. Soon after, their correspondence ended. The alliance that had seemed unbreakable just years before was gone. Their bond had been more than intellectual. It was personal, intimate, almost filial. Freud often said he thought of Jung as a son. Jung, in turn, confessed that he saw Freud as a father figure, the guide who had opened the hidden world of the unconscious to him. For 7 years, they wrote letters almost weekly, over 300 in total, filled with theories, confessions, even dream interpretations. Few scientific partnerships in history had been so passionate, so personal, and ultimately, so fragile. In 1909, they embarked on a journey together to the United States. For 7 weeks, they lectured at Clark University in Massachusetts, introducing psychoanalysis to an American audience. On the long voyage by ship, they spent hours walking the deck, speaking of dreams and symbols. Freud shared his own dreams with Jung, and Jung analyzed them boldly, sometimes touching on themes Freud found threatening. On one occasion, as Jung pressed him about his hidden anxieties, Freud suddenly fainted. Jung revived him, but the event left an indelible mark. Jung later wrote that it seemed to him Freud was collapsing under the weight of his own unconscious. This trip, celebrated publicly as the triumph of psychoanalysis, was privately the beginning of the end. Jung's interpretations often reached beyond sexuality into myth and religion, which made Freud uneasy. Freud wanted psychoanalysis to be seen as scientific, anchored in biological drives. To him, Jung's willingness to explore mysticism and myth was dangerous, a threat to the fragile legitimacy of their movement. The conflict came to a head in their letters. Freud's tone shifted from warm mentor to stern authority. He once told Jung, "Promise me never to deviate from the sexual theory. It is our bulwark against the black tide of occultism." To Freud, this was not simply a scientific principle, it was a defense line against irrational chaos. To Jung, the request was intolerable. "Science is not a creed," he replied. "It must never be a matter of faith." The tension grew unbearable. In 1912, when Jung published Symbols of Transformation, Freud felt betrayed. The book was dense with mythological images, religious parallels, and a vision of libido as a universal life force rather than narrowly sexual energy. Freud dismissed it as fantasy. For Jung, however, this was the book that declared his independence. He was no longer Freud's disciple. He was charting his own path. Colleagues began to take sides. Many in the psychoanalytic movement branded Jung a traitor, accusing him of abandoning science for mysticism. Freud, wounded and angry, encouraged the split. He would later say that Jung had been lost to psychoanalysis. For Jung, the excommunication was devastating, a public humiliation, a loss of colleagues and friendships he had once cherished. Yet there was also relief. Jung admitted that he had often felt crushed by Freud's authority, suffocated by his demand for loyalty. Breaking away was like breaking free from gravity. But freedom came at a terrible cost: isolation, confusion, and a sense of being abandoned in uncharted territory. Jung's break with Freud was not only professional, it shook him to his core. He had lost a father figure, a mentor, and the intellectual family that had given him purpose. His colleagues whispered that he had betrayed science, that he had drifted into mysticism. Some even mocked him, saying he had gone mad. Yet Jung could not force himself back into line. Where Freud insists on belief, he wrote, "I cannot believe. I must know." For him, loyalty to Freud would have meant betraying his own experience. And Jung valued the truth of inner experience more than the safety of belonging. He dreamt of Freud as a sorcerer king, enthroned but brittle, surrounded by loyal followers. In these dreams, Jung felt both awe and suffocation. It was as if his unconscious was telling him, the old order is powerful, but it cannot contain you. And so he stood alone. For the first time, Jung realized he could not lean on a master's shadow. He would have to descend into the depths of the psyche by himself, without map, without guide, with only his visions as companions. It was a terrifying prospect, but also the doorway to the work that would define his life. In the months after the break, Jung wandered through days of silence. He described it as standing on a cliff edge, the ground behind him collapsing, the horizon ahead wrapped in mist. Without Freud's authority to lean on, every question of the psyche was now his alone to answer. But instead of retreating, he leaned further into the unknown. He wrote in his journals that if science could not hold the depths of the soul, then he would risk madness to enter them himself. "I had to obey an inner law which was stronger than any external one," he confessed. This decision, to trust the visions, the symbols, the whispers of the unconscious, would change the rest of his life. It was in this void that Jung began to experience visions, rivers of blood flooding Europe, dead bodies floating through fields. At the time, he thought he was losing his mind. But 2 years later, the First World War would erupt, and Jung realized that his visions had been a premonition of the collective catastrophe about to engulf humanity. For Jung, the separation was devastating. He lost not only a mentor, but an entire intellectual family. Colleagues who had admired him now turned their backs. He was accused of heresy, of abandoning psychoanalysis for mysticism. Freud dismissed him with a single line, "Jung has become a mystic." Yet in the silence that followed, Jung felt a strange liberation. He had paid the price of independence. He was alone now, but free to follow the path that called him. What he did not yet know was that this freedom would plunge him into the darkest and most dangerous period of his life, the descent into the unconscious itself. After the break with Freud, Jung entered the darkest chapter of his life. The outer world saw a respected doctor and professor who had simply stepped away from psychoanalysis. But inside, Jung felt as though the ground had been ripped out from beneath him. He described the years between 1913 and 1917 as his confrontation with the unconscious. It was a descent, not into theory, but into visions so overwhelming that he feared he was going mad. It began with dreams. Just before the First World War, Jung dreamt of oceans of blood flooding across Europe, corpses floating through cities, entire civilizations drowning in crimson waves. He thought these were signs of his own mental collapse, until 1914, when war did indeed engulf the continent. Only then did he realize his visions had been not only personal, but collective, the psyche of an entire culture breaking apart. By day he worked with patience. By night, he entered the abyss. He set aside hours to sit alone, letting images rise from the depths. He called this method active imagination. Instead of dismissing fantasies, he gave them form. He spoke with inner figures, drew their faces, recorded their voices. What most people repress as nonsense, Jung treated as sacred encounters. The result was astonishing. His journals filled with dialogues between himself and mythic characters, an old man with wings named Philemon, who became his guide, a serpent and a dove locked in eternal tension, a dark figure representing his own shadow. These were not metaphors to Jung. They were living presences, fragments of a deeper order of reality. To capture them, he began writing in a massive red leather-bound volume, what he called Liber Novus, later known as the Red Book. In swirling calligraphy and vivid paintings, he recorded his journey into the unconscious. He painted mandalas, visions of gods, scenes of death and rebirth. The book was so personal, so raw, that Jung kept it hidden for the rest of his life. He feared people would think he was insane. Only in 2009, nearly 50 years after his death, was it published. And when readers opened its pages, they saw not madness, but a mythic odyssey unlike anything in modern psychology. Jung later wrote, "The years, of which I have spoken to you, when I pursued the inner images, were the most important time of my life. Everything else is to be derived from this." For him, the Red Book years were the crucible. Out of chaos came the foundation of his psychology. But the journey was terrifying. Jung described nights of despair when he believed he was possessed. He would hear voices, see images of the dead, feel torn between reason and the abyss. "I was menaced by a psychosis," he admitted. And yet he did not flee. He surrendered to the experience, trusting that the soul's images, however strange, had meaning. It was during this descent that Jung discovered the idea of archetypes. He realized that the figures he encountered were not just his own inventions. They were patterns, timeless forms. The wise old man, the shadow, the anima, these appeared not only in his fantasies, but in myths across history, in his patient's dreams, and ancient texts he had never studied. He concluded that the unconscious was not only personal. It was collective, shared, a kind of psychic inheritance of humanity. During these years, Jung also experienced what he later called numinous encounters, moments that felt like direct contact with the divine. In one vision, he saw a giant figure of God defecating on a cathedral, an image that shocked him. But rather than blasphemy, Jung saw it as the psyche's way of showing that divinity has a shadow as well as light. He later explored this theme in Answer to Job, where he dared to confront the darker side of the biblical God. In 1916, in the midst of this inner storm, Jung wrote a strange text called The Seven Sermons to the Dead. It came to him in a rush, as though dictated by another hand. In it, he borrowed the voice of the ancient Gnostic Basilides, delivering sermons to the restless dead who crowded at his house. The sermons spoke of the pleroma, the fullness of the divine, and of the opposites that shape existence, life and death, light and darkness, good and evil. Jung saw this as an eruption of ancient wisdom through his own psyche. At times he doubted himself. Was he insane? Was he speaking to real spirits, or to fragments of his own unconscious? Yet he came to believe that the distinction did not matter. The psyche was real as matter, and its voices deserved to be heard. He built a stone tower on the shores of Lake Zurich at Bollingen, carving inscriptions into the walls, creating a sanctuary where he could paint, sculpt, and dream. This tower became a symbol of his individuation, a physical reflection of the inner world he was building. Looking back, Jung admitted he risked everything in those years. "I had to let myself plummet down into the depths," he said. "Only by daring the descent could I find the ground upon which to stand." And it was true, out of the visions, the voices, and the fear of madness, came the central concepts that would define his life's work. By 1917, the worst of the storm had passed. Jung emerged shaken but alive, with a new psychology forged in fire. He was no longer Freud's disciple. He was something else entirely, a man who had descended into the abyss of his own mind and returned with a map of the underworld. Jung's descent took form in a single, monumental object, the great red leather volume he called Liber Novus, the New Book. Today we know it simply as the Red Book. In its pages, Jung poured the visions that haunted him. He did not simply describe them, he illuminated them in brilliant calligraphy and vivid paintings. Mandalas of fire and geometry, mythic figures with wings and crowns, landscapes of death and rebirth. Some pages resemble medieval manuscripts, others resemble the hallucinations of a prophet. Jung was both the scribe and the pilgrim, recording a private scripture of the unconscious. He wrote dialogues with inner beings who spoke with their own voices. Philemon, the winged old man who became Jung's spiritual guide. Elijah and Salome, figures of wisdom and temptation. The serpent and the dove, locked in endless conflict. Jung treated these encounters not as fantasies, but as events as real as waking life. He said, "To the extent that I managed to translate the emotions into images, that is to say, to find the images which were concealed in the emotions, I was inwardly calmed and reassured." For Jung, the Red Book was both dangerous and holy. Dangerous, because to reveal it would be to risk being labeled insane. Holy, because it contained the seed of everything his later psychology would become. He would later confess, "The years when I pursued the inner images were the most important time of my life. Everything else is to be derived from these." And yet, he never published it. For the rest of his life, the Red Book stayed locked away, shown only to a few close friends. When asked about it, he would say it was too personal, too intimate. It was not until 2009, almost half a century after his death, that the world finally saw it. Scholars and readers alike were stunned. What lay hidden was not the ravings of a madman, but a mythic journey unlike anything in modern thought, a blend of psychology, scripture, and art that revealed the birth of a new vision of the human soul. In the mandalas Jung painted, he saw the image of wholeness, the self, the center that unites the fragments of personality. These circles became symbols of his individuation process, his belief that the human psyche strives toward balance and unity. Every spiral, every radiant cross, every geometric pattern was a message from the depths, pointing toward the same truth, that the soul is not chaos, but cosmos. To look at the Red Book is to watch a man wrestle with his own madness, and out of it, carve a philosophy of meaning. It was a private gospel, born not from dogma, but from direct experience of the abyss. In 1916, in the midst of these visions, Jung felt his house fill with the presence of the dead. He described the atmosphere as suffocating, as if spirits pressed against the walls. To release them, he sat down and wrote a text in a fever, the 7 Sermons to the Dead. The words came, he said, as though dictated by another hand. He signed the text not with his own name, but with that of Basilides, a Gnostic teacher from Alexandria in the 2nd century. In these sermons, Jung declared truths that had never been part of his conscious knowledge. He wrote of the pleroma, the fullness of the divine beyond all opposites, and of how the human soul is torn between pairs of contraries, light and darkness, good and evil, spirit and matter. The sermon spoke of Abraxas, a God who unites creation and destruction, love and terror, in one being. Jung had never studied these Gnostic doctrines in detail, and yet they rose spontaneously from his unconscious. To him, this was proof that the psyche holds an ancient memory, a reservoir of wisdom that transcends the individual. The 7 sermons were more than mysticism. They were a turning point. Jung realized that the unconscious does not only contain personal memories or repressed desires. It contains archetypal knowledge, images that belong to humanity as a whole. He began to see his own visions not as private hallucinations, but as messages from what he later called the collective unconscious. This insight became the seed of his concept of individuation. Just as he struggled to reconcile the voices of his number 1 and number 2, so too must every person reconcile the opposites within, reason and intuition, masculine and feminine, light and shadow. The goal is not to suppress one side, but to unite them into a greater whole. Individuation is not perfection, it is wholeness. Jung knew he had risked his sanity to reach this realization. "I had to obey an inner law which was stronger than any external one," he wrote. The descent nearly destroyed him, but it also gave him the framework that would guide the rest of his life. Emerging from these years of visions, Jung felt compelled to give his inner world an outer form. On the shores of Lake Zurich, he began to build a tower at Bollingen, stone upon stone, by his own hand. At first a small retreat, the tower grew into a labyrinth of rooms, inscriptions, and carvings. He painted symbols on the walls, engraved Latin phrases, and sculpted figures from his dreams. Bollingen was not a vacation home. It was a sanctuary, a monument to the descent he had endured. Jung called it his real self, a place where his soul and the stone spoke the same language. In the mandalas he painted, and in the tower he built, Jung saw the same truth: the psyche is not merely personal. It is cosmic. Every individual carries not just memories and complexes, but the entire history of humanity, myths, gods, ancient wisdom, woven into the unconscious. To heal oneself is therefore not only to confront one's shadow, but to reconnect with the whole of existence. Reflecting later, Jung wrote, "Only in the afternoon of life does meaning arise. One lives one's life as it happens, and only afterwards does one discover its pattern." For him, the confrontation with the unconscious had been the crucible that revealed that pattern. The descent into madness had been, in truth, a descent into meaning. Jung's visions were not only personal. He began to see them as windows into the fate of an entire century. The rivers of blood that flooded his dreams before 1914 were not hallucinations, they were prophetic images of the First World War. Jung believed that what erupted in Europe was the same force he had confronted inside himself, the unleashed shadow of humanity. He wrote that his own descent mirrored the collective descent of the West. As nations marched to slaughter, he felt that he, too, was being torn apart by forces larger than himself. But instead of projecting them outward, Jung turned inward. He realized that every individual carries within them the same dark energies that can erupt in war and destruction. The collective catastrophe, he said, begins in the souls of individuals who refuse to face their own shadow. In memories, dreams, reflections, he confessed, I had to admit that what I had experienced was not only my personal affair, but had significance for many others. For the collective unconscious is common to all. He understood that the visions of corpses and blood were not symptoms of psychosis, but symbols of a civilization in crisis. This conviction gave his work a new urgency. Jung saw himself not merely as a doctor of individual patients, but as a physician of culture. If modern humanity was to survive, it would need a new language for the soul, one that embraced myth, symbol, and the unconscious, instead of suppressing them. At times, Jung admitted he was terrified. He wondered if he was breaking apart, if the voices and figures would consume him. But he also knew that to resist them would mean destruction. I let myself plummet down into the depths, he said, because only there could I find the ground upon which to stand. He believed that every person who avoids the confrontation with their unconscious will eventually be possessed by it, and the results can be catastrophic, not only for the individual, but for the world. Jung came to see his personal descent as an initiation, a modern journey into Hades. Where the ancients told of Orpheus or Odysseus descending into the underworld, Jung had lived that myth himself. And like those heroes, he returned with gifts, the insight that only by facing the shadow can the self emerge, and that the darkness of the psyche, once integrated, becomes the source of light. And this descent, terrifying, chaotic, transformative, would not only save Jung himself. It would give the 20th century a new language for the soul. After years of inner turmoil, Jung emerged with an idea that changed the map of the human mind. What he had encountered in his visions was not just the residue of his own life, not only the forgotten memories of childhood or the suppressed emotions of a doctor under strain. It was something older, deeper, and far more universal. He came to call it the collective unconscious. The unconscious, Jung realized, was not only a private cellar where repressed desires hid in the dark. It was also a vast reservoir of images and patterns that belonged to all of humanity. It was a memory older than the individual, a heritage woven into the psyche. Every human carried it, just as every body carries the blueprint of the species in its DNA. The evidence surrounded him. In his patients at Bergallsli, he saw recurring images that could not be explained by personal experience. A woman with no education dreamt of symbols that matched medieval alchemical texts she had never seen. A schizophrenic described a vision of the sun with a phallic tube, a precise image from Mithraic rituals recorded in antiquity. Children told of luminous beings, devouring monsters, and cosmic battles, motifs found in myths of Greece, Egypt, and India. Again and again, Jung realized that what emerged from the depths of one person's unconscious could mirror stories from cultures separated by oceans and centuries. This was the key: human beings dream in myth. We are storytellers even when we sleep. The figures that rise from the unconscious are not random, but patterned. The hero, the mother, the wise old man, the shadow, the trickster, the child. These are not inventions of culture, Jung argued. Culture itself is an expression of them. From the pyramids to fairy tales, from shamanic visions to modern cinema, the same motifs repeat because they come from the same source within us. He wrote, in addition to our immediate consciousness, which is of a thoroughly personal nature, there exists a second psychic system of a collective, universal, and impersonal nature, identical in all individuals. In other words, we are not blank slates shaped only by environment. We are born into a drama that is older than us, and we spend our lives playing out variations of its themes. Jung often compared archetypes to instincts. Just as a bird does not learn to build a nest from scratch, but follows an inner program, so too does the psyche generate archetypal images without being taught. They are the inner organs of the soul, invisible structures that produce the symbolic language of dreams and religion. To see this more clearly, Jung studied myths and symbols from every culture he could find. He read the Rig Veda from India, the Taoist classics from China, the Gnostic texts of late antiquity, and the medieval grimoires of alchemists. He was not searching for exotic curiosities. He was searching for the same patterns. And he found them. The dying and resurrected God in Osiris, and Christ in Mithras. The divine child in Horus, and Krishna in Christ again. The wise old man in Hermes Trismegistus, and Lao Tzu in Merlin. The trickster in Loki and Coyote, and the jester of countless fairy tales. Humanity, he realized, was speaking a common psychic language. For Jung, this was not superstition but science, a psychology as real as anatomy. He insisted that archetypes were not fantasies, but fundamental structures of the human mind. They may appear in dream or myth, but their effects are tangible. They shape how we see others, how we interpret events, how we create culture. When a person meets their shadow in a nightmare, or sees a stranger as larger than life, it is the archetype making itself known. The discovery of the collective unconscious was Jung's great expansion beyond Freud. Where Freud had reduced the psyche to personal history and repressed sexuality, Jung opened it to the cosmos of symbols. Jung often emphasized that archetypes are not abstractions confined to textbooks. They erupt into daily life. A young soldier may see his commander not as an ordinary man, but as a towering father figure, embodying the archetype of the ruler. A child might project the image of the divine child onto a doll, treating it as if it were alive. A lover may find themselves enchanted, or even obsessed, not with the real person before them, but with the anima or animus they carry within, the unconscious image of the eternal feminine or masculine. He explained that this is why myths and fairy tales endure. They speak to forces within us that remain unchanged. The battle with the dragon is not just an ancient story, it is the struggle of every individual against fear, chaos, and the unknown. The descent into the underworld is not only for Orpheus or Dante, it is the pattern of depression, loss, and renewal in our own lives. And the trickster, who disrupts order with mischief and deceit, appears not only in Loki or Coyote, but in the colleague who undermines, the politician who deceives, or even the part of ourselves that sabotages our own plans. Jung once said, "We are not of today or yesterday. We are of an immense age." By this he meant that the images and instincts we carry are not inventions of the present moment, they are inheritances from countless generations. Our imagination is not private property. It is a continuation of humanity's oldest stories, resurfacing through us whether we recognize them or not. The unconscious was no longer just a vault of shameful desires, but a treasury of humanity's deepest images, a sacred archive in every mind. Jung explained that these primordial patterns do not remain in the realm of myth alone. They rise into our daily lives, shaping how we think, feel, and act. He called them archetypes, and though they wear countless masks, their outlines remain constant. One of the most important is the shadow. The shadow holds everything we reject about ourselves: anger, envy, lust, cruelty, but also the strengths we refuse to own. Jung warned, everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. When the shadow is denied, it does not disappear. It turns outward as projection. We see in others the darkness we cannot face in ourselves. Prejudice, scapegoating, the invention of enemies, all are shadow at work on a collective scale. Individually, to confront the shadow is frightening. Yet Jung believed it is the doorway to growth, because the energy bound in the shadow, once integrated, becomes fuel for transformation. Alongside the shadow dwell the figures of the anima and animus, the inner feminine in every man, and the inner masculine in every woman. Jung noticed that men often projected their anima onto women, turning them into goddesses or demons in their imagination. Women, in turn, projected their animus onto men, experiencing them as overwhelming authorities or saviors. These inner figures appear in dreams and fantasies, guiding or tormenting the dreamer. Jung insisted that wholeness requires integrating them. A man must make peace with his feeling nature, a woman with her reason and power, so that neither is dominated by an unconscious projection. Then there is the persona, the mask we wear for society. It is necessary, for without a persona we cannot play our roles as teachers, bankers, parents, or creators. But the danger lies in mistaking the mask for the self. Jung warned that the man who believes he is only his job title, or the woman who identifies only with her social role, risks spiritual death. The persona is a costume. Without awareness, it becomes a prison. Beyond these lies the archetype of the wise old man, appearing as guides, prophets, magicians, Merlin in Arthurian legend, Gandalf in Tolkien, or the humble sage who speaks a single truth that alters a life. Balancing this figure is the Great Mother, both nurturing and devouring, appearing as Isis, Mary, Kali, or the fairy tale who both protects and consumes. And always at the edges lurks the trickster, chaotic, mocking, destructive yet renewing. Loki in the Norse sagas. Coyote in Native American lore. The Joker in modern cinema. The trickster shatters structures, exposes hypocrisy, and forces transformation through laughter and disorder. Jung saw the trickster in patients who sabotaged themselves, in societies that unraveled through corruption, and even in the ironic twists of history itself. These figures are not abstractions. They are psychic realities, forces that move through individuals and cultures alike. We do not summon them, they summon us. Jung stressed that archetypes cannot be fully defined. They are mysteries that take form in images, myths, and dreams, yet remain inexhaustible. Jung warned that archetypes are not gentle ideas that one can play with at leisure. They are living forces, and when they rise unchecked, they can seize both individuals and entire societies. He saw this most clearly in the years leading up to the Second World War. In Germany, he observed how the collective shadow, resentment, fear, wounded pride, was projected outward and embodied in the figure of the enemy. At the same time, the archetype of the savior inflated itself into the figure of the Führer. The nation was possessed. Archetypes that normally appear in myth had stepped onto the political stage, with catastrophic consequences. For Jung, this was not metaphor but psychology. Just as an individual can fall into neurosis when overwhelmed by an archetype, a culture can fall into collective madness. He wrote, "The unconscious works sometimes with overwhelming force, producing effects far surpassing anything in conscious life. When a people refuses to recognize its shadow, it will seek scapegoats. When it refuses to balance its inner figures, it becomes vulnerable to possession by collective fantasies." He also saw these dangers in his patients. A man who rejected his own aggression projected it onto others, convinced that the world was filled with enemies. A woman who denied her anima fell into relationships where she worshipped or hated men as if they were gods or demons. Jung understood that such projections were not rational errors. They were the psyche's attempt to make us see what we cannot face directly. But if unrecognized, they distort reality. The shadow becomes them. The anima becomes the impossible lover. The persona becomes a mask that crushes the real self. And the archetypes, instead of guiding us, enslave us. Jung's insight was that the very powers that destroy us can also heal us if we confront them consciously. The dragon that devours in one story becomes the guardian of treasure in another. The shadow that sabotages us holds the energy we need to grow. The anima that misleads can also lead us into deeper connection. Archetypes are ambivalent, destructive when denied, transformative when embraced. He insisted that modern man is in special danger because we imagine ourselves free of myth. We think we are rational, scientific, modern. And yet, the less we acknowledge archetypes, the more powerfully they act upon us unconsciously. Jung said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. And so they are driven by them, blindly, without choice. To Jung, the task of our time was to make these unconscious forces conscious, to face the shadow, to recognize the anima and animus, to strip the mask from the persona. to listen to the wisdom of the archetypes without letting them possess us. Only then could the self, the deeper center of the psyche, emerge as a unifying force. Jung believed that the key to surviving these forces lay in symbols. Archetypes are too vast, too primal, to be grasped directly. But when they take symbolic form, they become approachable. In dreams, in myths, in rituals, the psyche speaks a language we can learn to read. He gave special attention to the mandala, the circular patterns he painted during his Red Book years. To Jung, the mandala represented the self, the center that unites the opposites. When a patient drew or dreamt of a mandala, it was a sign that their unconscious was trying to restore balance. He called such symbols healing images, messages from the depths guiding the conscious mind back to wholeness. This is why Jung urged people to take their dreams seriously. A dream of falling might reveal not only fear, but the call to descend into the shadow. A dream of a child might signal the birth of new potential. Even nightmares, he argued, are not enemies but teachers. Dreams are the guiding words of the soul, he wrote. Why should I henceforth not love my dreams and not make their riddling images objects of my daily consideration? Symbols were also the bridge between psychology and religion. Jung saw that religious traditions are vast symbolic systems, created not by arbitrary invention but by the unconscious itself. Whether in Christian sacraments, Buddhist mandalas, or alchemical emblems, the same archetypes reappear. They are humanity's attempt to relate consciously to the powers within. For Jung, the danger of modernity was not that we had myths, but that we believed we had none. In truth, we are surrounded by them, in politics, in movies, in personal obsessions, but without awareness, we are their victims instead of their partners. The task of individuation, he said, is to engage the symbols consciously, to work with the archetypes rather than be ruled by them. Jung warned that the influence of archetypes does not vanish in the modern world simply because we no longer speak the language of myth. On the contrary, he argued, they often return with even greater power precisely because we are unconscious of them. The worship of celebrities, the fever of political rallies, the hysteria of financial bubbles or social movements, all bear the mark of archetypal possession. He pointed to advertising and propaganda as modern rituals. Posters and slogans, designed to bypass reason and touch the unconscious directly, summon archetypal images of saviors, mothers, warriors, and enemies. The crowd responds not as rational individuals, but as vessels of myth. Jung wrote that when people believe themselves enlightened and free of myth, they are in fact most vulnerable. For the archetypes, denied in consciousness, slip in through the back door and seize the imagination without warning. This is why Jung insisted that psychology was not just about personal healing. It was a cultural necessity. A society that does not recognize the reality of its own archetypes risks being devoured by them. To integrate one's shadow, to engage with dreams and symbols, was not merely private therapy. It was, in Jung's words, a moral task with implications for humanity as a whole. At the heart of this work stands the self, not the ego, not the mask, but the deeper totality that embraces shadow and light, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious. The self is the goal of individuation, the inner center that brings order to the chaos. And every symbol of wholeness, from mandalas to divine children to sacred circles, points toward it. Jung believed that the purpose of human life is not happiness, not success, not even adaptation in the narrow biological sense. It is individuation, the lifelong process of becoming whole. By individuation, he meant the integration of all the different parts of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, masculine and feminine, reason and instinct, into a greater totality that he called the self. Individuation is not about becoming perfect. It is about becoming complete. Jung compared it to alchemy, the ancient art of transformation. Just as the alchemist sought to transmute base metals into gold, the individual must transmute their raw instincts, fears, and wounds into wisdom and strength. The gold is not external wealth but inner wholeness. Central to this journey is the confrontation with the shadow. Jung insisted that every person carries a shadow, the qualities they deny, repress, or disown. These can be dark impulses, anger, envy, greed, cruelty, but also hidden gifts we refuse to claim. Perhaps the courage we disavowed, the creativity we buried, the assertiveness we feared would make us unlikable. All that we exclude from the image of ourselves gathers in the shadow. The shadow is dangerous precisely because it is unconscious. What we do not face in ourselves, we inevitably project onto others. The man who refuses to admit his own weakness despises it in his colleagues. The woman who denies her ambition sees it only in rivals. On the collective scale, entire societies create scapegoats, enemies, witches, foreigners, heretics, onto whom they cast their denied impulses. Jung saw this clearly in the political movements of his time. But he also warned, it is not only in history. Every individual who avoids their shadow becomes a danger to themselves and to others. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This sentence, often repeated, carries the essence of individuation. It is not enough to aspire to purity or positivity. Light without shadow is illusion. To truly grow, one must descend into the abyss of the self, confront what lurks there, and integrate it into the conscious personality. Jung often compared this process to meeting a stranger. The shadow feels alien, even hostile, because it carries what the ego cannot accept. In dreams, it often appears as a dark figure, a rival, an enemy. But Jung insisted that this figure is not to be destroyed but recognized. The shadow is us. Only by facing it do we recover the energy it holds. He described individuation as an ordeal, a hero's journey. It demands sacrifice, humility, and courage. Just as the mythic hero must face the dragon before finding the treasure, so too must the individual face their own darkness before discovering their self. The treasure is hidden in the cave we fear to enter. This is why Jung believed modern humanity was in crisis. Surrounded by technology, consumed by distraction, people fled from their inner lives. They avoided silence, avoided dreams, avoided their own shadow. The result, he warned, was projection on a massive scale, political polarization, hatred of the other, mass movements driven by unconscious forces. Without individuation, the world itself risks being torn apart by collective shadows. For Jung, individuation was not a luxury. It was a moral imperative. He wrote, "The better a man knows his shadow, the less he will be enslaved by it." To know oneself is to become free, not free of instincts or darkness, but free to choose rather than to be driven blindly. To integrate the shadow is to reclaim one's humanity, to accept the fullness of what one is. And so, individuation begins not in light, but in darkness. Not with ideals, but with honesty. It begins the moment we ask, what do I refuse to see in myself? What am I projecting onto the world? What figure comes to me in dreams, whispering truths I do not want to hear? To follow those questions is to begin the journey Jung called the most essential task of a human life. If the shadow is the first threshold of individuation, then the anima and the animus are the next. Jung saw that every man carries within him an unconscious image of the feminine, and every woman carries within her an unconscious image of the masculine. These inner figures are not simply learned from parents or culture. They are archetypal patterns, inherited forms that shape how we relate to the opposite sex and to the hidden sides of our own psyche. For men, the anima is the inner feminine. She appears in dreams as a mysterious woman, a lover, a muse, sometimes a witch or a goddess. The anima is not the man's wife, nor any single woman, but the psychic image of the eternal feminine. Jung warned that if a man does not recognize his anima, he will project her onto real women. He will see them not as they are, but as screens for his unconscious fantasies, the perfect mother, the temptress, the angel, the destroyer. The danger is obsession and disappointment, because no living woman can carry the weight of such a projection. For women, the animus is the inner masculine. He appears in dreams as a powerful man, a guide, a father, a prophet, sometimes a tyrant. The animus can give strength, clarity, and reason. But when unconscious, he appears as dogmatic opinions, as an inner voice that declares, you must, you should, this is the truth. Jung said that many women suffer under the tyranny of an animus that is not integrated, a chorus of inner critics disguised as reason. Like the anima, the animus must be recognized, confronted, and transformed. Jung saw countless examples of these forces in his patients. A man who constantly fell in love with women who later turned into bitter enemies was wrestling with his anima. A woman who heard commanding voices in her head, pushing her into destructive choices, was struggling with her animus. These figures were not just psychological quirks. They were expressions of the collective unconscious, archetypes demanding recognition. But the anima and animus are not only dangers. They are bridges. They connect the ego with the unconscious. A man who learns to listen to his anima gains access to his feeling life, his creativity, his capacity for relationship. A woman who integrates her animus gains confidence, clarity, and strength. When embraced consciously, they become guides toward wholeness. This is why individuation demands that we encounter the opposite within ourselves. A man must make peace with his inner feminine, or he will be ruled by it in projection. A woman must recognize her inner masculine, or she will be driven by it in shadow. To refuse this task is to remain incomplete. To accept it is to expand into a greater, more balanced self. Jung often used myth and religion to illustrate this truth. In alchemy, the union of king and queen symbolized the union of opposites, the conjunctio, the sacred marriage. In Christian mysticism, the soul was often described as feminine, longing for union with Christ as the bridegroom. In Eastern philosophy, yin and yang expressed the interdependence of masculine and feminine. Across traditions, Jung found the same message: wholeness is not found in purity of one side, but in the union of both. He described individuation as a series of encounters with these inner figures. First the shadow, then the anima or animus, then deeper archetypes that point toward the self. Each step requires courage and honesty, because each reveals something we would rather not see. Yet each integration expands the horizon of the personality, bringing us closer to the wholeness that Jung believed was our true destiny. Jung believed that individuation does not happen in theory but in practice, through daily encounters with the unconscious. The unconscious speaks in symbols, and the most direct path to those symbols is through dreams. He urged his patients to take their dreams seriously. Not as random nonsense, not as chemical byproducts of sleep, but as messages from the depths of the psyche. A nightmare, Jung insisted, is not simply a disturbance. It is the unconscious trying to say, "Here is what you are refusing to face." A dream of falling is not only fear, it can signal the need to let go, to descend into the shadow. A dream of a house may represent the whole structure of the psyche, with hidden basements and unexplored rooms. A dream of a child may be the emergence of new potential, the birth of a future self waiting to be lived. He often asked patients to record their dreams, sketch them, even paint them. In the colors and shapes of those drawings, Jung believed the unconscious was revealing its language. He himself had done this in his Red Book years, when he filled page after page with visions of mandalas, circular patterns that appeared spontaneously in his imagination. To Jung, the mandala was the symbol of the self, the center of wholeness. When a patient dreamed of a circle, a wheel, a radiant flower, he saw it as a sign that the psyche was attempting to restore balance. Jung once wrote, "Dreams are the guiding words of the soul. Why should I not make their riddling images objects of my daily consideration?" He saw the dream not as an obstacle but as a compass, pointing toward the next step in individuation. But dreams were not the only path. Jung explored myths, fairy tales, alchemy, and religion, all as symbolic systems created by the unconscious. The medieval alchemist, he argued, was not merely trying to turn lead into gold. He was projecting the process of individuation onto matter, dissolving, purifying, recombining, until a greater wholeness emerged. To read alchemy psychologically was to read the unconscious as it spoke to an entire culture. In religion, Jung saw the same function. He did not ask whether doctrines were literally true. Instead, he asked, what symbols are at work here? The death and resurrection of Christ, he argued, is a symbolic expression of transformation. The ego must die for the self to be born. In Buddhism, the mandala of the cosmos expresses the same wholeness that his patients drew in their notebooks. In Hindu myth, the dance of Shiva embodies destruction and creation as one. Across cultures, Jung found the same archetypes at play, guiding humanity toward balance. He believed that every individual participates in this symbolic drama, whether they know it or not. A modern man who believes himself secular, rational, immune to myth, may still be living out a story, chasing the hero's quest in his career, projecting the anima onto partners, worshipping idols in the form of celebrities or ideologies. To Jung, the unconscious will be lived one way or another, either consciously, through the work of individuation, or unconsciously, through projection and obsession. Jung emphasized that individuation is not a straight path. It is not achieved by a single vision, a single analysis, or a single act of will. It is a slow, often painful process of becoming aware, of facing what has been ignored, integrating what has been split off, and allowing symbols to guide the way. He compared the task to walking a narrow ridge between two abysses. On one side lies identification with the conscious ego, the belief that I am only what I know about myself. On the other side lies being swallowed by the unconscious, losing oneself in fantasies, delusions, or archetypal possession. The work of individuation is to hold the tension between these extremes, to remain conscious while engaging the depths. This is why Jung spoke of the need for patience and endurance. Dreams often resist interpretation. The shadow resists acknowledgement. The anima and animus resist integration. Again and again, the ego tries to flee, to rationalize, to return to comfort. But individuation demands that we stay with the images, the conflicts, the contradictions, until something new emerges. He said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. But one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. He also insisted that individuation is not selfish. At first glance, it may look like a private journey, a person studying their dreams, painting mandalas, confronting their inner world. But Jung argued that this is the greatest service one can render to others. For the person who has integrated their shadow, anima, and persona does not unconsciously project them onto family, friends, or society. They carry their own darkness, and in doing so, they free others from it. He believed that much of the world's violence and hatred comes from individuals refusing to face themselves. Individuation also means listening to the subtle signals of life. A recurring dream, a synchronicity, a symbol that keeps appearing, these are not accidents. Jung urged people to treat such experiences as if the psyche itself were trying to speak. Sometimes, he said, an entire life changes course because a person takes one dream seriously. For Jung, the self, the archetype of wholeness, often reveals itself in hints and fragments. A dream of a radiant child, a vision of a mandala, a moment of profound meaning when two events coincide. He called such coincidences synchronicities, meaningful connections that cannot be explained by cause and effect. To Jung, these were signs that the individual was in dialogue with a deeper order, that the unconscious was cooperating with the conscious in the work of transformation. Yet he never romanticized the process. Individuation is not comfort. It is conflict. It often brings crises, breakdowns, or losses. The ego is forced to relinquish control, and this can feel like death. But to Jung, this death is necessary, for it makes possible a greater life. Just as myths tell of heroes descending into the underworld, so too must the individual accept descent before renewal. He believed that the reward of individuation is not perfection, but authenticity. To live not as a mask, not as a projection, but as a whole person who carries light and shadow together. Such a person is not free of pain, but they are not broken by it. They are aligned with the self, the deeper center that holds the opposites. And in that alignment, they find meaning, the one thing Jung thought modern humanity needed most. Individuation, Jung said, is not the privilege of the few. It is the task of every human life. To ignore it is to remain divided, to live only as fragments of what one could be. To take it seriously is to risk everything, to walk through shadow and contradiction, but also to find meaning. He often described individuation as a pilgrimage, not outward to distant lands, but inward into the labyrinth of the soul. Each encounter along the way is an initiation, the shadow, the anima or animus, the persona, the figures of myth that rise in dream and vision. Each demands humility, honesty, and courage. Without these encounters, the ego remains swollen, rigid, blind to the forces that truly move it. Jung believed that our age suffers because people refuse this journey. Surrounded by distractions, overwhelmed by noise, we seek comfort in roles, possessions, ideologies. But beneath the mask, the shadow festers. What is denied within returns through projection, and hatred, prejudice, fanaticism. He warned that when the individual does not face the unconscious bursts forth collectively, sweeping nations into hysteria. The wars of the 20th century, he argued, were not only political events. They were eruptions of archetypes through societies that had lost their inner balance. This is why individuation is not simply self-help. It is a moral responsibility. A person who confronts their own darkness, integrates their shadow, and reconciles the opposites within, becomes a stabilizing force in the world. They no longer need to demonize the other, because they recognize the enemy within. They no longer need to worship false saviors, because they have met their own anima or animus and claimed their inner strength. Jung believed that in a time of mass movements and propaganda, the individuated person is the only true counterweight. He also knew the cost. Individuation is rarely smooth. It brings crises, doubts, even despair. At times, Jung said, the psyche itself seems to resist, as if testing whether the ego is strong enough to withstand transformation. Many turn back. Many prefer the comfort of illusion, the mask of persona, the simplicity of blaming others. But those who persist find something greater. They discover that the self, the archetype of wholeness, is not a fantasy, but a living center that orders the chaos of life. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." To him, this was not poetic rhetoric, but a psychological truth. To become whole is to live in alignment with the self, to embody both light and shadow, reason and instinct, masculine and feminine. Such a person is no longer divided. They radiate authenticity, and in that authenticity lies healing, not only for themselves, but for others. He warned that modern humanity's greatest danger is meaninglessness. Without a sense of inner purpose, people become prey to despair, addiction, violence. Individuation, he argued, is the antidote, for it gives life direction not from outside authorities, but from the deepest layers of the soul. To live one's own myth, rather than be possessed by the collective myths of the age, is the essence of freedom. As Jung's work unfolded, he returned again and again to this point. Individuation is not about transcending humanity, but embracing it fully. It means accepting that we are beings of contradiction, torn between opposites, yet capable of uniting them. It means carrying our wounds with dignity and our gifts with humility. It means recognizing that the self is larger than the ego, that the soul is older than our conscious life, and that we are participants in a drama much greater than ourselves. To ignore individuation is to remain trapped in projections, chasing illusions, repeating the mistakes of history. To embrace it is to step into the fullness of being, to carry both darkness and light, to live with meaning. Jung saw it as the only path by which humanity could avoid destroying itself, the path of individuals who dare to face their own souls. And it is here, in this demand to face the unconscious, that Jung leads us to the next step, how the psyche speaks to us through symbols, synchronicities, and myths. For individuation cannot proceed without language, and the language of the soul is symbolic. Jung often said that the psyche speaks in a language older than words, the language of symbols. Logic belongs to the ego, but the unconscious speaks in images, metaphors, patterns. A dream is not an argument, it is a picture. A myth is not a theory, it is a story that embodies forces too vast for rational analysis. To Jung, learning this language was essential, for individuation could not proceed without it. From the beginning of his descent, symbols had guided him. The serpent and the dove, Philemon the wise guide, the mandalas he painted in his red book, all of these were the psyche's way of expressing truths that could not be put into plain speech. He later wrote, "The symbol is the best possible expression for something unknown. When we dream of a house, we are dreaming of the self. When we dream of water, we are dreaming of the unconscious itself." Symbols condense entire worlds of meaning into a single image. Jung devoted decades to studying symbols across cultures. He was fascinated by alchemy, which he saw as a vast symbolic system, a projection of the unconscious onto matter. The alchemist's philosopher's stone was not simply a chemical product, but a symbol of the self, the wholeness the psyche seeks. The stages of alchemical transformation, nigredo, albedo, rubedo, mirrored the dark night, purification, and rebirth of individuation. What medieval seekers had enacted in their laboratories, Jung believed modern humanity must enact inwardly. He found the same symbolic language in religions. The cross of Christianity, the wheel of Buddhism, the yin-yang of Taoism, the sacred circle of Native American rituals, each was a symbol pointing to wholeness, balance, or the union of opposites. Jung insisted that these symbols endure not because they are enforced by institutions, but because they arise spontaneously from the collective unconscious. They are humanity's attempt to give form to the formless. Yet symbols also evolve. In modern life, Jung observed how cinema, literature, and even politics generated new symbols, the superhero as a modern god, the machine as both savior and monster, the alien visitor as the unknown other. The collective unconscious continues to speak, but in forms adapted to the age. To Jung, ignoring these symbols was dangerous. They will act on us whether or not we acknowledge them. The only choice we have is whether to engage them consciously or be ruled by them unconsciously. Symbols were also, for Jung, bridges to healing. He asked patients not only to interpret their dreams but to work with them, to paint them, write them, embody them. He called this method active imagination, where one enters into dialogue with the images. A dream of a dark figure, instead of being dismissed, could be confronted on the page. Who are you? What do you want? In this way, the unconscious is no longer a passive influence but an active partner. Jung knew that symbols cannot be exhausted. They carry layers of meaning that shift over time. To reduce them to a single definition is to kill them. He compared them to living beings, constantly unfolding, always pointing beyond themselves. A mandala is never just a circle, just as a cross is never just two lines. They are windows into the mystery of the psyche, doors through which the self communicates with the conscious mind. Jung believed that human beings cannot live without myth. Myths are not primitive stories to be discarded as humanity becomes modern. They are the deep narratives through which the psyche understands itself. Without myth, life becomes fragmented, meaningless, disoriented. With myth, even suffering acquires a shape, a purpose, a place in the great drama of existence. He once wrote, "When an inner situation is not made conscious, it appears outside as fate." Myths are the collective stage on which those inner situations are played out. They tell us where we come from, what trials we must face, and what destiny we are meant to fulfill. For the Greeks, it was Odysseus wandering the seas, facing gods and monsters before returning home. For Christians, it was Christ descending into death and rising again in glory. For Buddhists, it was the journey of the Buddha, leaving the palace of illusion to confront suffering and discover enlightenment. Jung noticed that no matter the culture, the patterns of myth repeat. The hero must leave home, face chaos, descend into darkness, and return transformed. The trickster disrupts, the wise guide appears, the sacred marriage unites opposites. These are not borrowed tales, they are archetypes expressing themselves in story. Myth is the collective dream of a people. In the modern world, Jung argued, old myths have lost their power. Religion has been questioned, rituals abandoned, sacred stories dismissed as superstition. But the psyche does not stop dreaming. When traditional myths collapse, new ones emerge. In literature and cinema, in ideologies and political movements, the archetypes return in disguise. Superman and Batman are gods in modern dress. Star Wars retells the hero's journey with light and shadow, master and apprentice. Nations cast their leaders as saviors or villains, entire populations are swept into mythic dramas of good and evil. Jung warned that these unconscious myths are dangerous precisely because they are denied. When people believe they are free of myth, they are most vulnerable to it. A man who rejects religion may still worship money, power, or ideology with the fervor of faith. A society that abandons its rituals may turn sports events, celebrity culture, or political rallies into substitute rituals, unconsciously reenacting the same archetypal patterns. He argued that modern neuroses often stem from a loss of myth. Patients told him their lives felt meaningless, empty, without direction. They did not know what they were for. Jung's answer was not to give them a ready-made doctrine, but to help them discover the myth they were already living. Each person, he believed, unconsciously enacts a story. The task is to bring it into consciousness, to see whether one is trapped in the endless repetition of the victim, the martyr, the wanderer, or whether one is walking the path of the hero toward individuation. Jung wrote, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents." In this, he was pointing to myth again. Families carry stories through generations. An unfinished task in one generation becomes the fate of the next. A son fights the battle his father avoided. A daughter bears the wound her mother denied. These are myths repeating themselves across bloodlines, demanding recognition. To break free is not to discard myth, but to live it consciously. Jung urged people to ask, what story am I living? What archetype is guiding my choices? Am I trapped in a shadow role, or am I moving toward wholeness? By facing these questions, a person begins to write their myth instead of being written by it. In myths, Jung found the blueprint of individuation itself. The descent of Inanna into the underworld, stripped of her garments and ornaments, mirrored the ego's stripping before the self. The trials of Hercules, facing impossible labors, mirrored the individual's confrontation with instinct and shadow. The sacred marriage of alchemy, the Konyakusho, mirrored the union of anima and animus. Myth, for Jung, was not entertainment but revelation. It was the psyche speaking in its oldest, most powerful voice. For Jung, perhaps the most controversial of his ideas was synchronicity. He used this word to describe meaningful coincidences, events that are not connected by cause and effect, yet seem bound together by significance. To him, synchronicities were glimpses of an underlying order, a pattern that joined psyche and matter, inner and outer worlds. The classic example comes from his own practice. He was treating a woman whose rational, skeptical mind resisted all symbolic interpretation. One day she described a dream of a golden scarab, a jewel in the shape of a beetle. As she spoke, Jung heard a tapping at the window. He opened it and caught a beetle, a scarab-like insect, rare in that region, which flew into the room. He handed it to her, saying, "Here is your scarab." The shock broke her defenses. For Jung, this was not mere chance. It was a synchronistic event, where inner and outer reality mirrored each other in a way that carried undeniable meaning. He collected hundreds of such accounts, dreams that predicted accidents, uncanny coincidences between thought and event, meaningful parallels that defied statistics. He did not claim they could be explained by science in the usual sense. Instead, he argued that they pointed to an acausal order, a deeper level of reality where psyche and matter are not separate but interconnected. Jung compared synchronicity to the Chinese concept of Tao, the flowing order of the universe. To him, it was as if the psyche and the cosmos were two reflections of the same underlying mystery. Sometimes, in rare moments, the veil lifts and we see that reflection clearly. He stressed that synchronicities are not to be confused with superstition. They cannot be forced or predicted like clockwork. They appear when they must, often in moments of great transformation. They shock the ego into realizing that life is more than a chain of mechanical events. Jung saw them as guideposts of individuation, signals that one is in touch with the self, aligned with the deeper flow of meaning. In one essay he wrote, "Synchronicity takes the coincidence of events in space and time as meaning something more than mere chance, namely, a peculiar interdependence of objective events among themselves as well as with the subjective states of the observer." In other words, it is not just that something happens outside and resembles something inside. It is that both inner and outer events are part of one greater tapestry. Many dismissed the idea as mysticism. Physicists challenged it, though some, like Wolfgang Pauli, the Nobel-winning quantum theorist who corresponded closely with Jung, found resonance in it. Pauli and Jung together explored the parallels between physics and psychology, wondering whether synchronicity might point to a unifying principle that underlies both matter and mind. For Jung, the importance of synchronicity was not to prove a theory but to recognize meaning. To a patient in despair, a meaningful coincidence could act as a turning point, restoring faith that life is not random chaos. To Jung, synchronicities revealed that the psyche is embedded in the cosmos, and that the self is not isolated but participates in a larger order of being. Jung insisted that synchronicity was not some exotic miracle reserved for mystics. It could appear in the lives of ordinary people at decisive moments, carrying a force that no logic could erase. A soldier on the battlefield dreams of his mother's voice calling him home, only to learn later that she died at that exact hour. A woman reflects on a lost love while walking the streets of a distant city, and at that instant hears his favorite song drifting from a cafe. A man wrestles with despair, debating whether life has meaning, when a book falls open to the very passage that answers his question. To dismiss such events as mere coincidence, Jung argued, is to miss their psychological truth. They strike us because they reveal a hidden order connecting inner and outer worlds. He stressed that synchronicity is not about predicting the future like fortune-telling. It is not causal, not mechanical. It is symbolic. The scarab did not cause the dream, nor did the dream cause the beetle at the window. Both arose from a deeper layer of order, meeting in a moment of meaning. In this sense, synchronicity is like a crack in the wall of materialism, a glimpse into a dimension where psyche and cosmos mirror one another. Jung saw synchronicity as an essential companion to individuation. As the unconscious guides a person with dreams and archetypes, synchronicities often mark the threshold between stages. They reassure the ego that the path is real, that the suffering has significance, that the self is actively shaping life. Many of his patients reported that when they began working with dreams or confronting the shadow, coincidences multiplied. Meetings with the right people, timely discoveries, uncanny parallels, the unconscious seemed to conspire with the outer world to move them forward. To Jung, this was not fantasy but fact. He described life as a drama in which the ego is not the only author. The self, the greater totality, arranges encounters that the ego could never plan. Synchronicity is one way the self announces its presence. It is as if the universe whispers, "You are seen. You are on the path. Keep going." He admitted that science had no category for such phenomena. And yet, he argued, to deny them simply because they resist explanation is arrogance. He often compared synchronicity to the Taoist concept of the Tao, the mysterious flow of life that cannot be forced but can be followed. When we align with the Tao, events seem to fall into place. When we resist, life fragments. For Jung, synchronicity was the psychological counterpart to this ancient wisdom. The danger, he cautioned, is inflation, treating every coincidence as cosmic revelation, falling into superstition or magical thinking. Jung insisted on discernment. Not every repetition is meaningful, not every chance meeting is destiny. The measure of synchronicity is its transformative power. Does it open new insight? Does it shift the soul? Does it deepen meaning? If not, it is noise. But when it does, it is the voice of the self breaking through the veil of chance. Perhaps Jung's boldest claim was that synchronicity reveals that psyche and matter are not separate realities but two faces of one mystery. In his words, psyche and matter are contained in one and the same world, and moreover are in continuous contact with one another. In synchronicity, that contact becomes visible. For Jung, symbols, myths, and synchronicities were not three separate curiosities, but three expressions of the same truth. The psyche is not an isolated mechanism locked inside the skull. It is part of a larger order of reality, one that constantly communicates with us through images, stories, and meaningful coincidences. To ignore these signals is to wander blind. To engage with them is to enter into dialogue with the self. Symbols are the language of the unconscious. They show us in dream and art what words cannot say. Myths are the collective form of those symbols, the great stories that have carried humanity for millennia. And synchronicities are their eruption into lived experience, when the outer world itself seems to conspire with the inner. Together, they remind us that we live not only in a universe of matter, but in a universe of meaning. Jung warned that modern man's greatest poverty is not material but symbolic. Surrounded by technology, dazzled by information, people lose touch with the images that give life coherence. Without symbols, there is no map. Without myth, there is no story. Without synchronicity, there is no sense that the cosmos itself participates in our journey. The result is alienation, despair, and the hunger for false gods. But when we recover this dimension, life changes. A dream becomes a message. A myth becomes a mirror. A coincidence becomes a confirmation. The world is no longer dead matter, but a living text in which psyche and cosmos write together. Jung believed that this shift, from a purely material view of life to a symbolic one, is essential for individuation and perhaps for the survival of civilization itself. He concluded that only by honoring symbols, myths, and synchronicities can modern humanity find its way back to meaning. They are not decorations for life. They are the threads that weave the tapestry of the soul. And if we learn to read them, we discover that the story we are living is not random, but part of an ancient drama in which each of us is both actor and witness. In the final decades of his life, Jung turned more and more to the archetype he believed stood at the center of the entire psyche, the self. The self, he said, is not the ego. It is not the conscious I that we identify with day to day. The ego is only an island in a much greater sea. The self is that sea, the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, shadow and light, masculine and feminine, mortal and eternal. He called it the God within, though he was careful to explain that this was not a theological claim but a psychological one. Humanity has always placed its image of wholeness in the divine, mandalas, crosses, sacred centers, radiant beings. Jung's insight was that these symbols all point to the same reality inside the psyche, the self, the inner image of wholeness. Dreams often reveal the self in symbolic form: the radiant child, the wise old man, the divine couple, the mandala, the shining light. To encounter such symbols is to glimpse the center that unites all opposites. For Jung, individuation was the process of approaching this center, of aligning the ego with the self so that life could be lived not in fragmentation, but in harmony. He described the self as both guide and goal. It is the force that draws us into conflict, demanding that we face the shadow, meet the anima and animus, and shed the mask of persona. And it is also the image of completion that awaits us at the end, the promise that the fragments of the soul can be woven together. The self is not invented. It is discovered, revealed through symbols, synchronicities, and transformative experiences. Jung often said that the self speaks when the ego has been humbled. In crises, in dreams, in visions, when the conscious mind can no longer hold its illusions, the self breaks through. Sometimes gently, sometimes with overwhelming force. The task of life, he argued, is to recognize and respond to this inner voice. In his own late years, Jung felt the self pressing upon him with ever greater clarity. He dreamt of luminous figures, of vast mandalas, of journeys beyond death. He sensed that the self was not only the center of the individual psyche, but a reality that connected humanity itself, a kind of inner bridge between man and the cosmos. He wrote, "The self is our life's goal, for it is the completest expression of that fateful combination we call individuality." To Jung, to miss this goal was to miss life itself. To reach it was to fulfill the purpose not only of the individual, but perhaps of the human species. Jung never tired of repeating that the self is not an idea invented by psychology. It is an experience, often overwhelming, sometimes terrifying, always transformative. He described patients who dreamt of radiant mandalas, of divine children, of luminous figures appearing in moments of crisis. These images arose spontaneously, not from culture or teaching, but from the depths of the psyche itself. Again and again he saw that, when people approached the limits of despair, the unconscious produced symbols of wholeness. It was as if the self itself was trying to heal them, to show that life held a center even when the ego had collapsed. For Jung, the self was the inner counterpart of what humanity has always called God. He argued that the religious instinct is not a cultural superstition but a psychological fact. The human mind spontaneously generates symbols of the divine because it carries the archetype of the self. Across cultures, he saw the same motifs: the shining mandala of Buddhism, the circle of Taoist philosophy, the Christ image in Christianity, the sacred child of countless mythologies. These were not borrowed from one another but expressions of the same archetype. And yet, Jung was careful to emphasize that the self is not identical to God in a theological sense. Rather, it is the image of God within the psyche, the bridge between human consciousness and the mystery of existence. To experience the self is to glimpse a unity that transcends opposites, a reconciliation of contradictions that the ego cannot resolve. He called it the imago Dei, the image of God, and he believed that without some relationship to this image, the human being is incomplete. Modern man, who dismisses religion as superstition, is often left spiritually adrift because he has lost touch with the archetype of the self. The result is a hunger for substitutes, ideologies, addictions, idols of money or power. Jung warned that these false centers are dangerous, for they inflate the ego rather than humble it. Only the true self can provide lasting meaning. In his own life, Jung experienced the self not only in dreams but in waking visions. During his Red Book years, he met Philemon, the wise old man who became his inner teacher. He dreamt of towers, of radiant mandalas, of vast landscapes that seemed to extend beyond death itself. Near the end of his life, after a heart attack in 1944, Jung reported visions of floating far above the earth, gazing down at the planet bathed in blue light. He felt he was approaching a great temple in space, radiant with meaning. Though he returned to life, the vision never left him. He believed he had glimpsed the realm of the self, the eternal dimension that transcends the individual. Jung often warned that approaching the self is not without danger. The experience is numinous, overwhelming. The ego can mistake itself for the self, falling into inflation, believing one is a prophet, a messiah, a chosen one. History is filled with such delusions. To truly relate to the self requires humility, the recognition that the ego is not the center of life, but only a part of a greater whole. He wrote, "The encounter with the self is always a defeat for the ego. Yet in that defeat lies renewal." When the ego bows to the self, it is not destroyed but placed in its rightful position. Life gains direction, not from personal ambition alone, but from alignment with the deeper order of the psyche. For Jung, this was the culmination of individuation, the discovery that one's life is not a random sequence of events, but a meaningful journey guided by an inner center. The self is the goal, the compass, and the source of that meaning. Without it, life fragments into chaos. With it, even suffering becomes part of a larger pattern. Jung's writings about the self were not mere abstractions. They were born from his own most intimate and sometimes terrifying experiences. Unlike many theorists, he did not separate psychology from life. His theories were forged in the fire of visions, dreams, and encounters that shook him to the core. During his midlife crisis, the long descent that produced the Red Book, Jung encountered images that convinced him of the self's reality. Philemon, the wise old man with kingfisher wings, appeared in his imagination and spoke as an autonomous figure, teaching him truths he could not have invented consciously. Jung said that Philemon represented superior insight, wisdom that came from beyond the ego. It was through Philemon that Jung learned to treat the figures of imagination not as fantasies but as realities of the psyche. For Jung, this was the self reaching out through symbolic form. He also dreamt repeatedly of mandalas, radiant circular structures filled with patterns and colors. They came to him spontaneously, sometimes in dreams, sometimes while painting. Each mandala felt like a message from the depths, an image of wholeness forming out of chaos. He realized that when the psyche is under strain, the self produces mandalas to restore balance. Later, he would discover the same symbols in Buddhist tankas, in medieval alchemical diagrams, and Native American rituals. To Jung, this was not coincidence but proof of the self's universality. Perhaps his most profound experience came in 1944, when he suffered a heart attack and hovered near death. For weeks he drifted in and out of visions. He described floating far above the earth, looking down at the globe shining in blue light. He felt freed from the body, immersed in a state of indescribable peace. He saw a great stone temple in space, radiant, filled with meaning. At its gate, he sensed he was about to enter a reality beyond time and space. But then he was pulled back. Doctors had saved his life. Jung later said that, though he returned, he was never the same. He had glimpsed the realm of the self beyond individual existence. The vision dissolved his fear of death. He wrote, "Our birth is a coincidence. Our death is a certainty. But what we are in between is not without meaning. For in the self, life and death are one." To Jung, this experience confirmed that the self was not only the center of the psyche but the bridge between the personal and the eternal. These visions shaped the last decades of his work. He became more open about the religious dimension of psychology, though always careful to ground it in experience rather than dogma. He argued that religion, at its core, is the psyche's relationship to the self, the attempt to give form to the encounter with wholeness. When people pray, meditate, or participate in ritual, they are not merely obeying institutions. They are responding to the archetype of the self, which insists on being recognized. Jung also admitted that such encounters are overwhelming. They cannot be commanded, only received. They often come in crises, when the ego is broken, when life collapses, when death approaches. At those thresholds, the self reveals itself. And when it does, the experience is unforgettable. In his last years, Jung spoke with increasing humility about his own destiny. He did not claim to have mastered the self, only to have glimpsed it. He said that psychology cannot capture its full reality, that words are only signs pointing to a mystery greater than the mind. But he was certain of one thing, that the self is real, that it is the goal of individuation, and that without it, human life remains incomplete. For Jung, the self was not only the destiny of the individual but also the hope of humanity. He believed that the greatest dangers of the modern age did not come from nature or even from technology, but from the unconscious forces erupting through societies. Wars, fanaticisms, ideologies, these were, in his eyes, collective possessions, archetypes seizing nations that had lost balance. He warned that the 20th century had proven one terrifying fact: human beings are most dangerous when they do not know themselves. The only solution, he argued, was individuation on a mass scale, not as a political program, but as millions of individuals taking responsibility for their own souls. To face one's shadow, to reconcile with anima and animus, to live from the self instead of the inflated ego. Jung saw this as the moral imperative of our time. Without it, humanity would remain trapped in endless cycles of projection, scapegoating, and destruction. He often said that modern humanity suffers from a loss of meaning. Science has given us knowledge, but it cannot tell us why we live. Religion has lost much of its authority, leaving people spiritually adrift. Into this vacuum rush ideologies, addictions, false saviors. Jung saw these as substitutes for the self, counterfeit gods that promise wholeness but deliver only inflation and despair. Unless the archetype of the self is recognized and integrated, the human hunger for meaning will attach to destructive forces. But when the self is glimpsed, even briefly, life is transformed. A dream that reveals a mandala, a synchronistic event that reassures us, a symbol that suddenly resonates with profound truth. These moments remind us that existence is not random, that the soul is not alone. For Jung, the self is the source of meaning, and meaning is the deepest nourishment of human life. He said, the decisive question for man is he related to something infinite or not? Without that relation, he believed, we wither. With it, we endure. Jung also saw the self as the bridge between cultures. He noticed that, beneath the surface of religions and philosophies, the same symbols reappear: the circle, the divine child, the wise guide, the union of opposites. These are not accidents. They are the expressions of the self, appearing wherever human beings seek wholeness. This is why myths echo across oceans, why dreams in Zurich mirror rituals in India. Humanity is bound by a common inner language, and the self is its grammar. He insisted that psychology was not a private matter but a contribution to civilization. Every individual who integrates their shadow contributes to peace. Every person who listens to their dreams brings more wisdom to the collective. Individuation, he argued, is the only antidote to mass madness. For the individuated person cannot be easily possessed by ideology. They know their own darkness, and so they are less likely to demonize others. They know their own inner God, and so they are less likely to worship false idols. In this sense, Jung believed the fate of the world depends not on politics or economics alone, but on psychology, on whether human beings dare to face themselves. The self, as the archetype of wholeness, is not just a private revelation. It is the key to survival, and in the twilight of his life, Carl Gustav Jung looked back not only as a scientist but as a man who had wrestled with the depths of his own soul. He knew that the theories he left behind, shadow, anima, archetypes, self, were not final truths, but attempts to give language to mysteries that can never be fully captured. He said, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." For him, psychology was never about labels. It was about becoming whole. Jung understood that to be human is to live in tension. Between light and darkness. Between reason and instinct. Between the ego that struggles for control and the self that whispers of a greater order. He believed that our task is not to eliminate these opposites, but to hold them until they reveal a higher unity. This, he thought, was the meaning of life, not perfection, but wholeness. Near the end, he often returned to the dream of the mandala, the circle that contains all opposites, the symbol of the self. For him, it was both beginning and end, alpha and omega, the eternal form that outlives every individual. When asked late in life whether he believed in God, Jung answered simply, "I do not need to believe. I know." By this he meant that he had experienced the archetype of the divine within the psyche itself. The self had shown him that meaning is not a human invention but a reality woven into existence. And so, Jung's legacy is not just a body of theory. It is a call to face the shadow, to listen to dreams, to honor symbols, to walk the long path of individuation. He left us no easy answers, only a map drawn in struggle, colored by visions, tested in the fires of history. But in that map lies a possibility that human beings, by becoming whole, might heal not only themselves but the world. His final message was simple yet profound: life has meaning. The psyche is real. The soul is older than we know. And if we dare to walk into the depths, we may discover that within us lives a center, the self, a spark of wholeness that binds us to one another, to the cosmos, and to the mystery that will always transcend us.
If the psyche is older than we are, then maybe we're just renting space in its story. The least we can do is pay attention.